President Bola Ahmed Tinubu has said that Nigeria cannot continue to use a major part of its revenue for external debt servicing. The president revealed this at the annual conference of the Nigerian Bar Association, as he also charged the private sector to help banish poverty in the country. Nigeria's revenues have dipped since 2020, with all outputs also fluctuating, while diversification of the economy has been suggested many times. The oil sector remains Nigeria's primary source of revenue despite its many intricacies. President Tinubu described the current revenue to debt servicing ratio in the country as a path to destruction and said hard decisions must be taken to help the country retrace its steps. Now, joining me tonight in Politics HQ is Dr. Muda Yusuf, CEO, Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, and also Olusiji Aina, a development economist, joins from the nation's capital, Abuja. One welcome to you, gentlemen, and thanks for joining me in Politics HQ tonight.
Thank you, Aborowa.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Happy to have you both with me tonight. I'd like to start with you, Dr. Yusuf, a former treasurer and vice president of the World Bank, Aroma Ote, lamented Nigeria's rising debt burden. She recently likened it to a man with a full family who spends all his income on paying debts without consideration for feeding, healthcare, and the education of his children. Just how bad is Nigeria's debt problem?
Well, the debt situation is extremely very bad, and there is no better way to illustrate it than what you quoted the president as saying, that we are spending close to 90% of our revenue to service debt. So, I mean, that is an extremely bad situation. It's like an economy that is already on the brink. And if nothing is done, and done quickly too, the whole economy may crash completely. So it's an extremely bad situation. And it's even more disturbing because over the years, government expenditure was growing as if there was no problem with revenue. And the matter was even made worse by the recourse to ways and means financing by the Central Bank of Nigeria. So we are not only indebted in terms of domestic debt, we are heavily indebted in terms of external debt. And on top of that, we had huge exposure, which were not even fully disclosed until the end of the twilight of the administration that just left. It wasn't fully disclosed. And with the CBN, we had an exposure of over 20 trillion naira. So we put everything together, we are talking of a total debt of about 77 trillion, which is very, very outrageous. So it's a very serious situation, and something drastic needs to be done urgently, both on the revenue side and on the expenditure side.
Thank you, Dr. Yusuf. I'd like to bring our second guest, Mr. Olusiji Aina, who's joining from the nation's capital, Abuja, into the conversation. Mr. Aina, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu's recent statement at the Nigerian Bar Association conference in Abuja reflects a departure from Nigeria's current economic philosophy. How do you assess the feasibility and potential impact of shifting away from allocating 90% of the revenue Nigeria generates to external debt servicing? How do we go about this, and how easy of a process will it be?
Oh, thank you again for having me. And I just want to totally align with what Doctor said, that the debt profile of Nigeria at this point is quite alarming. It's like we're in a precarious situation, in a situation that requires an ICU, intensive care unit, as a nation. And if nothing is done very quickly, it's more like we're at the brink of collapse. In fact, why we have not collapsed, I wouldn't know. Just like the president put it, about 90% of our revenue World Bank said about 100%. I remember the last report of KPMG put it on excess of 100%. And just like Dr. Muda mentioned as well, there was no total disclosure, not until we have this new administration. It was like we deliberately allow it to snowball into what we have. However, the President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, has decided to make some very, very tough policy decisions. My only question is, are we really looking at the holistic review of the entire decision in terms of all of the leakages, especially within the oil sector, where we are largely dependent on? Because again, I look at the entire last year, and the IOC put the total exposure or the leakages to about 2.3 trillion naira per annum. And again, if you look at the report, from the Nigerian Extractive Industry Transparency, that in the last 9 years, we've lost close to about 24 trillion as well to all of that. So if anything is going to be done very quickly and drastically, it's important that the revenue leakages within the oil sector, which is what we are largely dependent on, is quickly mitigated, or find a way to block all of those leakages before we begin to look at all of the other sectors that can drive revenue for us. This debt portfolio is already there. There is nothing we can do than to manage the situation. And in managing the situation is to be very intentional and very radical in terms of our approach to drive the revenue to grow from what it is at the moment. And I think the quick win where we have is all of those corruptions within the oil sector must be stopped. It's unfortunate that Nigeria, looking at where we are at this point, we don't have any functional refinery still at this point. And then if you look at all of the policies around the Naira, it's another mess entirely, which again is not helping the situation. So there must be a radical approach in terms of blocking all of those leakages within the oil sector. Very important. And I think that is one low-hanging fruit that the president can begin with. Before we begin to look at all of those other sectors, especially the other mineral resources, if you look at the leakages in the gold and what is happening in Sahara State, it's also something that must be looked into quickly, because these are deliberate openings that Nigeria is looking at, that we are losing revenue on a daily basis. But if the president can go beyond the policies on paper and put some actions into it in a way that can send a message and signal to those who are continually perpetrating that evil, then it's the right direction to go to be able to help us increase the revenue first, which is the first approach in this point.
Thank you, Mr. Aina. Dr. Yusuf, Mr. Olusiji Aina just described Nigeria's debt portfolio as very critical and is in what you call an intensive care unit. We've reached a critical point where it's no longer sustainable. But in analyzing the issues, we have to go back and do a prognosis. Dr. Yusuf, can you explain how Nigeria's debt profile has grown from 12.6 trillion in 2015, just 12.6 trillion, to over 46 trillion in 2023, despite efforts to address the issue? What factors contributed to this significant rise so that we don't make the same mistake again going forward?
Well, issue of debt is about the fiscal operations of government. And there are two major sides to the fiscal operations of government. There is the expenditure side, and there is the revenue side. So if you want to improve the fiscal situation, which is also related to the debt situation, you have to work on both sides. And if anything had gone wrong, then it will be attributable to either the expenditure or the revenue, or both. But I will ascribe what has brought us to this position as coming from both sides of the equation. The cost of governance has been ballooning over the last 1 decade. By the last 8 years of the past administration, the cost of governance was growing at a very, very rapid rate, almost doubling, if not even tripling. And when you have a system that continues to expand the cost of governance, the number of parastatals, the number of ministries, the number of appointees, and all of that. And government had the luxury of doing that because there was this opportunity of just borrowing, either through the domestic market or through the international bond market or through bilateral sources, or even from the central bank. So that created an environment where government was practically complacent and government was just spending without any form of caution. So the cost of governance was growing. There's also the corruption component of the cost of governance. Because it is not all this debt that you can attribute to the cost of personnel or capital projects. There's also the corruption component of it. There's the issue of the value for money and all of that. Because if you look at the Auditor General's report over the years, you will come to appreciate the magnitude of financial impropriety that has taken place over the years. Unfortunately, nothing concrete was done. These were reports that are properly documented by the Auditor General. They were presented to the key agencies of government. They were presented to National Assembly. But the political will to act on those reports were not there. And once people got away with such financial improprieties, once there are no consequences, these things will not only begin to repeat itself, it will begin to grow.
And become a culture.
Happened. Yes, that is what happened over the years. And it's something that cut across all the three tiers of government. They are talking of judiciary, they are talking of the legislature, we are talking of the executive, even the military. So that is on the expenditure side. On the revenue side, just as Mr. Aina said, the oil sector was supposed to, and is still the cash cow of this economy, both from the domestic revenue and from the external revenue. I'm talking of foreign exchange. But look at the impunity that has characterized that sector over the last 10 years or so, where there was no accountability, where there was massive oil theft, where there was all manner of impunity. Just as Mr. Aina said, people were carrying our crude in big vessels and leaving the shores of this country. It was as if there was no governance at all. So the economy was bleeding profusely from the oil sector.
Thank you, Dr. Yusuf. I would like to bring Mr. Olusiji Aina back into the conversation. Now, Mr. Aina, Dr. Yusuf talked about the opportunity, almost the culture of just borrowing and fiscal indiscipline. He also talked about the corruption component in how we have gotten to this situation where we're paying, using 90% of our revenue to pay to service debt. Quite shocking, to say the least. Now, Mr. Aina, what measures can be taken to address the issue of Nigeria's over-reliance on short-term borrowing to finance its operations, which has almost become a culture? And what policies can be implemented to increase revenue generation in Nigeria and reduce the need for loans and borrowing?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I think Dr. Yusuf has actually, spoken so passionately about some of those issues. And I recall very clearly last year at UNGA 77. I'm a United Nations diplomat. I was at UNGA 77. On the side of it, I know there are quite a number of ministers that came with the then former president, Muhammadu Buhari, who had no business in UNGA 77 at all. And if you look at majority of the MPAs and the leaders who are on the streets of New York, and I tell you now, if you Google and look at the cost of accommodation in New York at this point, it will amaze you that it goes as high as about $800, $900 per night. And a lot of these folks spend a whole week, if not more, on the streets of New York. I was at August 77 as a United Nations diplomat, like I mentioned, on my own accord. And I was on the same side meetings with at least 2 or 3 of those ministers, and they have nothing to contribute. I'm sorry to say this. But I think the president has taken the right decision on this particular August 78 by saying, if you have no business, do not go there. Because the cost on governance is so huge, and the recklessness of those expenses in the last 8 years was something that you cannot even mention. However, we must also begin to look at issues intentionally in terms of what we want to achieve. If there are projects that are not going to have direct implications on the people, on Nigerians, I think it's not necessary for government to begin to...
Could you give examples of such projects that have been embarked on by previous governments?
So I give you a very quick example. If you look at what happened in the Ministry of Humanitarian Affairs, where more than 2 trillion was spent during COVID to feed children who are not even in school, the level of fraud in that ministry is something that you cannot in any way. It's still a major issue, because I remember the current minister for Humanitarian Affairs was asked that same question if she was going to probe her predecessor or if she was going to query the register that was certified by World Bank. And she's saying they are going to evaluate it because a lot of the people that were supposed to be on that register were not there. That is one recklessness on his own part. Number 2, how can a serious government spend 8 years in office and none of our refineries worked, yet there were funds that were appropriated to revamp some of those refineries within the last 8 years and none of them worked? That is total wastefulness. And I don't think there's any way a serious government can decide to inject the kind of fund that was injected on some of those refineries without result. That was wasteful expenditure. Even the rail program that was done, you will see a lot of argument between then the Minister for Transport, Rotimi Amechi, and when they interviewed after they bombed that railway between Kaduna and Abuja. And he said there were certain things that were supposed to be included on that rail process that are supposed to give more like a security signal when things like that was going to happen, and it was shut down and pulled down at the Federal Executive Council. How can we waste such amount of money on railway
infrastructure
projects? Yes, and we cannot even see the value. We cannot even see the value. For a long time, that railway was not working. If we know we are not going to do something that will impact on the lives of the people directly, that can be seen, then there's no point wasting our resources.
So going forward, there should be a needs assessment. Sorry to interrupt you. Going forward, there should be a needs assessment on the potential economic benefits for the people and how projects can stimulate the economy for growth.
A thorough need assessment must be done. Proper and thorough need assessment must be done to evaluate what kind of project that we need to embark upon that can help the people. For example, as just a quick one, if you look at the current minister for FCT, went to the metro, asked some questions about some of the projects and the way those projects were structured, that there is no way those projects shouldn't have been completed at the stipulated period if it has been structured in a way that it can be financed. Most of those projects, millions, if not billions of dollars have been wasted, and they are about 50, 60 completion stage in 8 years without working. No nation can survive in doing that.
Absolute wastage, and we do need fiscal discipline. Thank you very much, Mr. Aina. Back to you, Dr. Yusuf. You were a former president of the Lagos Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Now, collaboration between the public and private sectors is pivotal in President Tinubu's vision for Nigeria's economic transformation. What role do you think the private sector can play from your experience in helping Nigeria address its debt burden and promote economic growth? And how can Nigeria improve its debt management practices to avoid a situation where it accumulates more debt in the future? I mean, we're already at a stage where we can absorb more debt.
Well, just to small correction, I was former Director General of Lagos Chamber of Commerce.
Director General, thank you for that.
Yes. Now, first, the private sector has a very big role to play, to reduce the exposure of government to some of these expenditures. For instance, there are quite a number of assets. Let's even start from there. Government assets that are wasting away all over the country, particularly properties. Some of them are sitting on very large expanse of land in very prime locations across the country. Quite a number of those properties are in Lagos. Some of them are being occupied by miscreants and area boys and all manner of criminals. There's a time that there was a proposal to privatize or sell off these assets. For one thing, that will give government some revenue. For others, it will help to create more employment opportunities. It will create opportunities for value creation. All over the country, you have close to 5,000 of such properties that are wasting away. If the government, for instance, engages the Nigerian Institute of Estate Surveyors and seek their advice that, okay, we have these properties, how can we unlock value from these properties? Value in terms of revenue to government, value in terms of investment in the economy. Look at the Federal Secretariat in Lagos. They are talking of Ikoyi. Look at even the former post office. Look at the Tafawa Balewa Square. So many properties like that. And it's not just in Lagos. So we need to convert idle assets into something that can create value for us. And we can do that in partnership with the private sector. Secondly,
hello, Dr. Yusuf, are you there? I think we're having some connection issues with Dr. Yusuf. So, Mr. Olusiji, okay, go ahead, please. Yes.
I mean, the former Minister of Aviation was talking.
Okay, we seem to be having some connection issues with Dr. Yusuf. So, Mr. I now let you have the final say on this. If you can, in less than a minute, I'll really appreciate, because we are fast running out of time on the program. President Tinubu's speech at the NBA conference did highlight banishing poverty as a prerequisite for Nigeria's prosperity. I mean, Vietnam has done it. China has, in the history of mankind, pulled out the highest number of people out of poverty in record time. So there are things that we won't be totally reinventing the wheel if we can't do so. But in your view, what structural reforms are necessary to effectively address poverty, and not just good sound bites, like doing the work that is required? How might these reforms influence income distribution and social equity? How do we address the issue of addressing the poverty situation in Nigeria?
Excellent. And I think the president has started on a good note. The reforms, the policies are already there. But in the entire world, no government institution can in a way balance the inequality or reduce the poverty that we have, or bring out all of those millions of people out of poverty all alone. One of the things I know that the government should do is to partner with the organized private sector to ensure that all of them are quite involved in the entire process. All of the INGOs working in the country, all of those different chambers of commerce and industry, and SMEDAN and the rest of them, they must come to the same bucket. And that's why I expect a lot of synergy between the Ministry of Trade and Investment and the Ministry of Blue Economy and the Humanitarian and Welfare. They must come together to be able to agree and not begin to create interventions that, in silos, that will in a way not be able to impact on the people. So the organized private sector has a lot to do on this role, because, for example, if a small or a micro business can employ up to 5 to 10 people at a go, then you can imagine the number of thousands, if not of millions of micro, small enterprises we have in this country. Then you can imagine the number of people they will pull out of poverty just in one engagement. So government should drive the policy, but they should allow the organized private sector to play the pivotal role in leading the conversation and driving, that particular engagement with Nigerians. The moment that can be done, where all of the microfinance institutions and credit institutions are strengthened, and then we can begin to lend at a single digit. All of those provisions, all of those interventions must be provided by government, through the Central Bank of Nigeria. But they should not take over the job, the organized private sector. They should not be the one disbursing funds. They should not be the one doing the training. They should not be the one engaging in all of that. They can control, they can regulate, they can supervise and drive that process while you watch the private sector begin to work in a way that can catalyze growth and begin to engage the people, unbundle them, and also begin to reduce that poverty level gradually. And I can tell you that in 4 years, we can make a serious milestone if government really engage with the organized private sector in a way that can become beneficial to the entire Nigerians.
Thank you so much, Olusiji Aina, development economist. Join us from the nation's capital, Abuja. We do appreciate your insights and candor. And I'd also like to express my gratitude to Dr. Muda Yusuf, CEO, Center for the Promotion of Private Enterprise, who joined in from Lagos. We do appreciate your time and contribution to Politics HQ tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You're watching Politics HQ tonight on News Central Television. We'll go on a quick break, and when we return, we'll look at the continued detention of the suspended Central Bank of Nigeria Governor Godwin Emefiele and the suspended EFCC Chairman Abdulrasheed Bauer, who are still in custody. We have some legal practitioners to help us look into this issue and to help engage in our discussion. Do stay with us. We'll be right back.